There is a document moving quietly, almost nervously, through diplomatic channels right now. It is being forwarded, bookmarked, printed, highlighted, whispered about. It is not the document you saw summarized in a press conference. It is not the simplified version folded into a 2-minute news segment before the anchor pivoted to something else. This document does not comfort. It does not reassure. It does not preserve the illusion that what happened during Hurricane Melissa was tragic but inevitable, devastating but unavoidable. This document fractures that illusion completely. It challenges the official story of Hurricane Melissa at its foundation. It forces us to confront not just what happened, but why it happened, and who bears responsibility for the conditions that made it possible. Compiled by United Nations scientists using analytical systems, satellite networks, and artificial intelligence platforms most Jamaicans have never been told exist. The document lays out 7 findings. 7 conclusions built on data, observation, and verification. 7 pieces of evidence that converge on one unavoidable truth. What happened to Jamaica was not merely an act of God. And the 6th finding, measured, methodical, devastating, is already being cited in international courts, not symbolically, not rhetorically. It is being used to redefine what the world is willing to call a natural disaster, to redraw the line between fate and responsibility, to ask whether destruction on this scale can still be dismissed as bad luck. But before we get to that, before we reach the finding that is now shaking climate law itself, you need to understand what the UN teams encountered when they arrived on the island. Because this story does not begin in a courtroom or a laboratory. It begins in wreckage. It begins in silence. It begins in places where maps stop being accurate. What the teams walked into was not simply damage. It was not just broken concrete, torn roofs, or bent zinc sheets scattered like playing cards. It was a transformed landscape. Entire neighborhoods unrecognizable. Roads that no longer led where they once did, familiar coastlines redrawn by force. What they found sent shockwaves outward through climate summits, insurance markets, financial institutions, and government ministries from Kingston to Geneva. The winds reached 185 miles per hour. That number alone should make you stop. 185, faster than a Formula One car at peak velocity. But even that comparison fails because a race car screams past you in seconds. These winds did not pass. They arrived and stayed. They wrapped the island in sustained violence for hours. Imagine standing in front of a jet engine as it powers up. The roar presses against your chest. Your breath shortens. Now imagine that jet engine stretches across an entire parish. Imagine it does not shut off. That was the sound. That was the force. And when the rain came, it did not fall from the sky the way rain is supposed to. It drove downward, weaponized by wind, sharp and punishing. Survivors would later call it steel rain, rain that bruised skin, rain that made movement painful, rain that turned streets into rivers and rivers into weapons. Then the sea answered. Waves rose 15, 20 feet high in some coastal areas. Walls of water climbing higher than the roofs of 2-story homes. Waves that lifted fishing boats, tore them from their moorings, and carried them hundreds of meters inland, depositing them in bedrooms, kitchens, schoolyards. Boats resting where children once did homework, boats resting where families once slept. This is the context. This is the ground truth. This is what the UN team stepped into. And almost immediately, the engineers, climate scientists, and disaster analysts understood something important. This was not going to be another standard relief assessment. This was not about counting tarpaulins or estimating food parcels. This was evidence collection. This was forensic work. This was about documenting a crime scene at planetary scale. Finding number 1 is where the story stops being about weather and becomes about survival. Economic devastation. Jamaica lost the equivalent of 30% of its gross domestic product in 1 week. 30%. A number so large it risks becoming abstract if we do not force ourselves to feel it. So let's slow it down. Imagine you work every day for an entire year, every shift, every side hustle, every sacrifice, every dollar earned with effort. Now imagine that on Christmas morning someone walks up to you and removes 4 full months of your income. January, February, March, April, gone, not postponed, not delayed, erased. Your rent is still due. Your children still need school supplies. Your obligations do not care that your income disappeared. Now take that feeling: panic, disbelief, anger, fear, and scale it to an entire nation. That is what happened to Jamaica. $7 billion US. And that number, the UN emphasized repeatedly, is preliminary. Because disasters like this do not end when the winds die down. The real damage unfolds slowly, quietly, and relentlessly afterward. Tourism bookings canceled not for days but for months. Revenue streams drying up. Small businesses unable to reopen because their equipment is buried, destroyed, or stolen. Jobs disappearing. Supply chains breaking, making imported goods more expensive. Inflation creeping upward. Purchasing power shrinking. Farmers losing entire harvests just weeks from market, destabilizing food security. To rebuild, the government must borrow billions, and borrowed money is never free. It comes with interest, conditions, and consequences. Money diverted from education, from healthcare, from infrastructure, for years, sometimes decades. The UNDP used 2 words that should haunt every policymaker and every citizen alike: generational shock. This is not a setback you recover from in an election cycle. This is a burden that moves forward in time. When a student applies for a loan in 2030 and wonders why interest rates are higher, Hurricane Melissa will be part of that answer. When a hospital renovation is delayed, when a school roof leaks, when a road repair is postponed, Melissa will be there, invisibly in the math, and that catastrophe bond that made headlines. The $150 million payout celebrated as proof of preparedness. It covers less than 3% of the damage. Less than 3. That is not insurance. That is symbolism. That is like losing your home to fire and being handed enough money to replace the welcome mat. Finding number 2 shifts us from spreadsheets to people. 1.5 million lives affected. Nearly half the population. 1 out of every 2 Jamaicans. But affected is a word without blood or breath, so let's give it meaning. It looks like at least 32 confirmed deaths, with that number expected to rise as rescue teams finally reach communities cut off for weeks. It looks like families across Hanover, Westmoreland, St. Elizabeth Trelawney, Clarendon waking up to homes partially damaged or completely erased. It looks like a mother in Negril standing beneath open sky where her living room once was, trying to explain to her 6-year-old why they cannot go back inside. It looks like an elderly man in Savannah Lamar surviving the storm in his bathroom, clutching a photo album while everything else he owned scattered across parishes. Shelters overflowed. Families slept in shifts. Food distribution lines stretched for blocks. People waited hours in the sun for rice and tinned mackerel. And then there were the invisible victims. The ones not centered in headlines. The UN Women Division documented what many reports missed. Over 445,000 women and girls directly affected. When power goes out, who washes clothes by hand? When water stops running, who walks miles to find it? When clinics close, who cares for the sick, the elderly, the children? When food runs low, who stretches one can across multiple meals? The UN found women's unpaid labor doubled overnight. Doubled, unmeasured, unpaid, largely unacknowledged. Confirmed deaths do not include the fishermen who never returned. They do not include the elderly woman in a remote village still unreachable because roads remain blocked. Confirmed only means counted. The real number always lives beyond that. Finding number 3 changed everything. 4.8 million tons of debris. The largest debris field in Jamaica's recorded history. Nearly 500,000 truckloads. A convoy stretching from Kingston to Montego Bay and back again, looping across the island like a scar. But the revolution was not just the scale, it was the method. AI-powered satellites assessed the damage from space in 72 hours. Neighborhoods erased, roads buried, forests flattened. From orbit, Jamaica's wounds were mapped with precision that ground surveys would have taken months to achieve. Finding number 4 broke that destruction into its anatomy. 2 million tons of building debris, homes, schools, clinics, churches, structures that held memory, identity, history. 1.4 million tons of personal belongings, furniture, tools, photo albums, heirlooms, livelihoods, things that cannot be replaced by checks or concrete. And 1.3 million tons of vegetation, forests, fruit trees, mangroves, crops. Natural defenses ripped away, leaving the island exposed to what comes next. Finding number 5 revealed collapse, debris blocking highways, bridges buried, 30 communities completely cut off, no ambulances, no food trucks, power lost across 2/3 of the island. Hospitals evacuated, neonatal units failing, dialysis interrupted, roads still impassable weeks later. This is what systemic failure looks like when everything is connected and everything breaks at once. And then came the question that reshaped everything. Could this storm really be explained by chance alone? Finding number 6 answered it. Human-induced climate change intensified Hurricane Melissa and increased its rainfall. Confirmed, peer-reviewed. Documented, heat trapped by decades of emissions supercharged the storm. This was not just nature, this was consequence. And finally, finding number 7 offered something rare, not denial. Not prayer alone, but direction. Recovery not as a return to vulnerability, but as a chance to build something stronger, smarter, safer, a fragile opening, a narrow window. A moment where devastation could become a turning point. This document does not ask us to grieve and forget. It asks us to remember, to reckon, and to decide collectively what kind of future we are willing to build from the ruins.